scripture for the message is Acts 24, verses 1 through 21. Now after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a spokesman, one Tertullus. They laid before the governor their case against Paul. And when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, "Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation, in every way and everywhere we accept this with all gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. For we have found this man a pestilence, one who stirs up riots among all of the Jews throughout the world. He's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to desecrate the temple, but we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him." The Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so. When the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied, "Knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. You can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. They did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or the synagogues or in the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law, written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience, both toward God and man. Now after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation, to present offerings. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple, without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews from Asia, they ought to be here before you to make an accusation, should they have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before their council, other than this one thing, that I cried out while standing among them. It is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day." May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. Trusting and hoping in Jesus causes differences in our behavior. Now, these differences are not always appreciated by those that are around us. Jesus' goodness leads us to want to strive towards goodness as well, but others resist this. Maybe simply because they don't like change in our actions, or maybe our actions cause them to feel guilty for things that they're still doing. We can't control other people. Their reactions to us might not be very good at times, even if the only thing we're really guilty of is trying to worship and serve the true God. So then this is a call for endurance for us as Christians. In fact, Jesus plainly said, if they rejected me, they will reject you also. This is what our text is lifting up for us today. Paul now is at Caesarea, which is on the Mediterranean Sea, and he's with the Roman governor. There's a fortress there and all. It's the seat of Roman power in the area. And we'll find that this passage we have before us is the closest thing to a trial that Paul's going to get from either what came before or what's going to come in the following chapters. It's not really much of a trial, as we'll see, especially next week, but at least you get two sides presenting their cases. On the one hand, the chief priests and elders come to accuse Paul. They hire a public speaker. The name Tertullus is a Latin name, so he's probably not even Jewish. He's probably just a professional public speaker. The name rhetor in the original language, we get rhetoric from that, rhetoricians. It means somebody who can use flowing language and make language sound beautiful. And so they hire this Tertullus to speak. And notice he starts by flattering the governor when he had summoned him to speak. We experience much grace through you, and reforms occur for this nation because of your foresight. We receive these things always and everywhere, excellent Felix, with all thanksgiving. So he's really buttering him up quite a bit. According to outside texts, Felix probably was fairly corrupt and he was disorderly in his administration. But he's saying, oh, we get so much peace and reforms through you, O Felix. And then he kind of keeps going, we don't want to take up too much of your valuable time, but please listen to us briefly in your beneficence or your kindness. And then he turns his tone and he has accusations against Paul that are strong and extreme. We find this man a pestilence. So he's a disease among us, making insurrections among the Jews and all the inhabited world, and being a leader of the heresy of the Nazarenes. Now, the causing insurrection or riots would be the only charge that the governor would really be interested in. But Tertullus continues. He was trying to desecrate the temple, but we seized him before he could start his rebellion. You yourself can determine this by questioning him. And then all of the Jewish leaders, the high priest and the elders that were there all said, yep, this is exactly what's happened. The governor nods to Paul. You've been judge for this nation for many years, so I'll gladly make my defense. You're not new here. You've seen ways we Jews act, and so I'll gladly tell you what happened. You're able to determine, Paul said, that I came to Jerusalem only 12 days ago. So there would be ship's logs from when he, passenger logs from when he had disembarked, and then when he came down Jerusalem, there would have been records of that. So he's telling Felix, you can look these things up, yourself, have your soldiers look them up for you. 12 days is hardly time to organize a rebellion. I came, Paul says, to worship. They didn't find me arguing or forming a mob in the temple or in synagogues or even in the city. And now they can't prove what they're now accusing me of. But one thing, Paul says, I confess. Or in other words, I'm only guilty of one thing. That according to the way, and remember that was a term for those who believe in Jesus and how their behavior changes when they believe in Jesus. They are called the way. According to the way, which they call a heresy, I worship the God of the fathers. So that's the only thing I'm guilty of, is worshiping the true God. Believing all which is according to the law and written by the prophets, having a hope unto God. So my hope is God himself, Paul is saying. I am awaiting, just as these men are awaiting, a resurrection of the righteous and the unrighteous. And in this way of behaving, I myself also strive to have a pure or blameless conscience toward God and all men in all things. It was with this behavior, he tells Felix, that I was bringing alms for my people. The alms were those, and remember there had been a famine in Judea, and so he was bringing relief, whether food or money or both, from Greece and Turkey down to be able to help the people that were suffering from the famine. I was bringing alms from my people, and I was offering sacrifices. Doing this, they found me in the temple, not with a crowd or a tumult. But some Jews from Asia, and he seems to pause here, because he remembers that as a Roman citizen, he has the right to have his accusers face him in person. And he said, it is necessary that they be here if they have anything against me. Or, he says, as far as these Jewish leaders that were there, if they have them say what they found unrighteous in me when I stood before their council and said, I'm on trial because of the resurrection from the dead. And we remember a couple of weeks ago what happened was the council broke into arguments because the Pharisees believe there is a resurrection and the Sadducees believe there is not a resurrection from the dead. And so they just started arguing with each other, and they didn't accuse Paul of anything. But he's saying these people that are here in my presence, if they have something against me, and as I was in their council, they should be able to state. And he knows they had no charge they brought against him. So we'll see next week that Felix will adjourn this trial. We'll see why he adjourns it. But here we just are noting what Paul has basically said is, I'm only guilty of one thing, of worshiping the true God. He hopes in Jesus. He trusts in him. And that causes differences in Paul's behavior. But his fellow Jews can't accept that different behavior. It's Jesus' goodness that leads him to strive for goodness himself. But his own people reject him, just like they first rejected Jesus. We too will find that in our desire to serve Jesus, that will bring others into conflict with us. Sometimes that can be resolved, and oftentimes it is not, and we are simply called to endure. We can't control others' behavior, but we can continue to follow Jesus in our own behavior. Let's hear about a woman named Jane Conner, how she tells us she first experienced God's grace, but then also experienced conflict. The grace came as Jesus worked through Ruby, a 57-year-old widow. Jane was the girlfriend of Ruby's 27-year-old son, Jim. She said two women couldn't be different than her and Ruby were. Ruby was a devout Christian who attended church every time the doors were open. Jane described herself as hard-drinking, foul-mouthed 20-year-old who was living with her son without being married. At first, it amused Jane that when she would say some type of profanity that Ruby would not be able to stop herself from flinching at hearing that kind of language. But as the months went on, they said that they started to develop a relationship. Ruby would often invite her to church. Jane made excuses. She did agree to go. There was a special service coming up. There was a missionary who wouldn't normally be there, and he was going to come and be the speaker. And so she agreed to, she said, to earn brownie points, quote unquote, with her future mother-in-law. At that service, Jane heard from the missionary that Jesus loved her enough that he'd even die for her. She almost cried, but she didn't want to ruin her tough lady image. And yet she saw Jesus' love in action after the service, when many of the people from the church came up and welcomed her and showed an interest in her. And that night later, she reflected, both the message and the people made me hope for a type of love I hungered for. Ruby continued to accept Jane even though her behavior didn't really change very quick. It was months later at Easter, again, probably one of those special times, okay, I'll go to church then. She attended, and Jane felt a love from God that she nor anyone else really deserved. I felt peace and a deep joy. I couldn't wait to tell Jim. When she did, he was very cautious, wondering what changes might come. Lifestyle changes weren't instantaneous for Jane, but after 2 months, she knew that she wanted to serve God in a deeper way. And so she moved out of Jim's place. Now came the conflict. He accused her of being holier than thou. She decided also to stop drinking. He drank more. He would go out to bars by himself and spend most of the night out drinking. But Jane's conscience, like Paul's before him, was clear. She was just trying to do right and to worship God. She was God's child, and it seemed in order for her to act in that way now involved surrendering Jim. She lived in a tent in a campground for a while. She couldn't afford any rent, and she didn't want to move in with Ruby or another church member because she knew that Jim would blame them for having her leave him. It was a difficult time, she said, but Jesus walked with me through that lonely valley. The story could have ended there, as many stories of conflict do, but in this particular case, 2 months later, Jim asked if they could date again. They both knelt down together and asked Jesus to be the head of their lives. 4 months later, they were married. And by now, they have a teenage son. And she sometimes worries about the friends that he might bring home and whether they would be a bad influence or not. But then she remembers how Ruby treated her. And she knows what she's called to do. Trusting and hoping in Jesus causes a change in our behavior. And those differences aren't always appreciated by others. But Jesus' goodness leads us to strive for goodness. That we can't control other people or their behavior towards us. But let us strive to have a good conscience, to be guilty of only one thing, of trying to worship and serve the true God by loving the Jesus who first loved us.